I'm going to turn this over to Wesley Tucker. He's from the University of Missouri. He's going to cover some of the family meetings aspects of the farm succession programming. So with that, Wesley, I will turn her over to you.
Thanks, Heather. Really appreciate the opportunity, and thanks everyone for registering and signing on today. Yeah, as she said, we're going to kind of talk about some of the tools and skills that we can use to enhance and address, enhance our communication and address conflicts. This is not anything that none of you don't already know, but I really feel like in the rural communities, we're getting to a tipping point. If you look back to the ag census data, unfortunately, they changed the way they asked this in 2017. So it's not exactly, we don't have the 17 data, but if you look at all the previous censuses, the younger generation is controlling and owning less and less of the land and operations, while the older generation is controlling more and more. As I said, here we're in 2022, we'll have the next ag census, and I hope they go back to asking this in a way that we can show this. It's just, I think it's unbelievable to think how rural America, as I said, is kind of at a tipping point, that whether you are a crop producer, whether you are a livestock producer, or to be quite honest with you, whether you own a hardware store on rural Main Street, I feel like rural America is at this point that in the next 10 years, we're going to have this massive amount of businesses roll over to the next generation. And we've got to make sure we're doing this effectively if we want to keep them in operation. One other piece of data I thought I'd show you real quick. It's interesting that of those that have said they plan to retire in the next 5 years, 53% of those have no succession plan. And 16% of them say they have a successor, but that currently doesn't even work on the farm yet. So only 19% of our operations are actively have their successor already actively involved in their operation. We've got to get better at this if we want those businesses to continue. One of the things, I'm right in the middle, actually, of a series that I'm doing for the Missouri Department of Agriculture. I've had two workshops the last couple of nights, and then I get back on the road tomorrow for a couple of more. We've got 8 workshops scheduled around the state of Missouri. But one of the things I always have the producers do, the data is fine and dandy, but I always have them stop and think about an operation in their local area that was a very successful farm, but that after the funeral, the wheels all came off. And to think about that operation as we start this process. And then at the end, I'm going to ask them again to think about that operation and to think how it might have been different if they'd have done some of the things that we recommend. So why am I so interested in succession planning? Why is this my passion? I am a cattle producer from the Ozarks of Missouri. I've been with the University of Missouri for about 20 years now, but I'm also a farmer. And my training and background is not in being a consultant in succession planning. My background is an ag economist, to be more specifically, a livestock economist. Next week, I'll be teaching a feedlot management school. I teach grazing schools. That's really what my training is in. And I am just as comfortable. I've had the opportunity to speak at conferences from, I believe, Wisconsin to Texas on grazing management. But 10 years ago, just a few months longer than 10 years ago, in March of 2012, I was sitting in the Women in Agriculture National Educators Conference in Memphis, Tennessee, and John Baker showed this very next slide here. This was a slide that many of you have probably seen John show, but he showed the point that he said if a farmer's priority is simply passing the land on to their kids, all they need is an estate plan. And to be quite honest with you, any rural community lawyer can probably help you craft a trust or a will or some type of mechanism to pass your assets to your kids. But when he pointed out that if a farmer's priority is actually seeing the family business continue, then you actually need a succession plan even before you need an estate plan. Because, yeah, you've got to think about the assets, but you've also got to think about how do I try to retire and how do I prepare my business successor to be able to take over the operation? And then what do I do if I've got more than one heir, but only one of them is going to come back and take over the operation? And when John showed this slide in 2012, it just really started to click for me. And John and I became good friends, and he became a very strong mentor to me. And I learned so much from him through the years. That was in 2012 that I met him. 1 year later, in 2013, now my mother is in the picture with me because my father passed away. And just like many of the operations that you professionals work with on a daily basis, my wife and I's operation was very intertwined with my parents' operation. And thankfully, I'm a one child of two, so I only have one sister. But even going through that process 1 year later, I realized just how important this is to help families realize that family dynamics are extremely important. And so I went ahead and joined IFTN, went through the coordinator training. And again, as I said, just became really close with John and tried to learn as much as I could from him through the years. But, I think a lot of people say, well, you probably would have been smarter if I would have just stayed with cows because they are a lot less messy than families. There is no doubt about that. But I am going to try to make this a little bit interactive at least. I want to ask you guys to put in the chat box, what is the hardest part of being in business with family members? So of the clients that you work with, or if you are a producer yourself, what do you see as the hardest part of being in business with other family members? Put a couple of things in chat for me if you can. I see some of you are on your iPhones. That may not be possible. Dealing with conflict, communication, assumed roles. Oh, absolutely. Running the business as a business and keeping the family dynamics out of it. Saying no to financial matters when you disagree. Talking about the tough issues that may create conflict. Absolutely. Being treated as the kid when you're still 45 plus years old. Respecting each other's, dealing with seated loyalty, who works the most hours. We're going to talk about that in a second. Separating family from business and differing with long-term goals. Absolutely. You guys see, I'm preaching to the choir. You guys know all of this stuff already, don't you? This was one of John's slides. If some of you can remember, they might have seen some of, remember back when you took the training, just that conflict between the two systems colliding, right? Between the family system and the business system. John used to always say the family system's all about being loving and loyal and affectionate and not changing. We want to be the same. Whereas a business system is all about being aggressive and changing and all about being, innovative and constantly looking for different ways to do things. And so those two systems are always on a collision course to create conflict and make a family business really, really hard. To be honest with you, family businesses are the hardest there is to run. And there's a reason why they have the lowest success rate. I wish I had the Staples easy button for them, but none of us do, right? It takes a lot of hard work. And that's why producers need so many of us professionals to help them through this process. But one of the things that I really tried to stress to the people that I work with is the idea of intentional communication. If you think about what it takes to make a successful marriage, most successful marriages are based on communication. And so I always like to ask when I'm in a group, unfortunately, I can't see your faces and see your hands here, but I always like to ask how many of us have a regularly scheduled date night? If I ask the crowd what the most important thing for a successful marriage is, they will say communication. And so I say, well, how many of you have a regular date night? And almost nobody raises their hands. And I'm like, wait a minute, you just told me communication was vital, but yet you don't take time to schedule it and have that regular communication forum. Why not? Because life gets in the way, right? And family businesses are absolutely the same. There is always something on the farm that needs to be done. And so life just gets in the way of us taking time to stop and communicate. So we have to get very, very intentional about it and schedule it. And I'm going to talk about 3 different types of family meetings that I think are so vital that we've got to have on the calendar to make that communication happen. The other thing I want to point out is it's not just the family and business colliding of how it impacts the business, it also impacts the family. This was a quote from Randy Weigel from the University of Wyoming that I just found so interesting. The way he put it was that in a family where you don't stay business partners with your family, you're not in business with one another. When you become 18 and leave the home, you emerge from out from under your parents' control. You are no longer under your parents' thumb when you leave the home. But unfortunately, because we are business partners with our family members, just as Heather said in that chat, in that comment there, we tend to stay assumed as a subordinate, no matter how old we are, in not only the business, but also in the family. And our parents stay the boss. And so that conflict not only impacts the business side, but it also impacts the family relationships as well and strains those. Now, what's the solution to that? As Randy said in the very last statement there, roles need to be negotiated constantly. And that's what I'm calling intentional communication. So let's talk just a little bit about how we can clarify some of those family roles and business roles to try to minimize conflict. Another graphic that I love to use, I don't know if most of you have probably seen it, but most of you have probably seen the Tagari and Davis 3-circle system of the family business. The reality is every every business has owners. So someone owns the business, right? And as an owner, they are entitled to a return on their equity from owning that business. Every business has employees that operate in the business realm. And as an employee or a manager of a business, I'm entitled to fair compensation for my time. Those 2 circles, ownership of the business and the employees of the business, is fairly straightforward for any type of organization. The problem is with the family business, we also have this 3rd circle that suddenly jumps into the mix, where a family member is entitled to love and respect from all other family members. All right. So if everyone in the family is also an owner of the business and also actively involved as an employee of the business, and those 3 circles sit right on top of each other, then this isn't that big of an issue. There's not conflict between the different roles and responsibilities. But when I have more than one child and only one's going to be in the business circle and some of the other ones may end up being heirs and be in the ownership circle, now I'm starting to get conflict, right? And one of the keys to this is to see those 3 circles as totally separate and independent. Let me give you a quick example. Okay. I've heard Dick Whitman use this example in the past. So he had a client that mom was a widow and had her 2 sons farming in the business with her. All right. One of the sons, he said, was a real pain in the you-know-what and was always causing problems. So someone recommended to the mom, said, well, your son's causing a lot of issues for your family and for your business. Why not doing a performance evaluation on him? And so finally, she put a lot of thought into it. She had a written performance evaluation and called him into the office to have a talk and said, hey, these are some things I really need you to try to improve on. You know what the son did? He wadded it up in a big ball and he threw it in the trash and he went back to work. All right. So family goes on. There's not a whole lot they can do about that at that point. Eventually, finally, an outside consultant gets called in. And one of the things, whenever that issue was brought up, he reminded him, said, well, now, wait a minute. What would have happened if you were working for someone else other than your mother, if you were working for the local co-op in town and you did that during your performance evaluation? And the son kind of laughed and said, I'd have probably been fired. And he's like, you know what? You're an employee in the business circle of this operation. You can be fired. No, but it doesn't matter that you are also in the family circle. You are an employee and you can be fired. And, he finally realized that. But the bigger important thing was mom realized that. Mom realized for the first time that she had been treating her son only as a family member. She was not treating her son as his roles and responsibility of the business circle. See, these are all three completely independent. Just because someone is in the family circle does not mean that everything falls over into the business circle. They have different roles and responsibilities. And I want to tell you, if you do want to make this, process a little bit easier for you, once you've had your first child, stop. All right. But when we have more than one, it often gets more complicated, doesn't it? Because often at least one or two children won't want to come back to the business. They want to go on to do something else. But what do we do whenever they become heirs to the business? So again, I could talk for 2 hours on these three circles, but learning to view them as separate and independent can really help separate those roles and prevent some of those conflicts. So let's think about how we can use family meetings, okay? Which of these, I'm going to ask you to put in the chat, which of these A, B, C, D, or E do you feel like is the most challenging relationship in the family business system? Is it the parent to the son or daughter? Is it the sibling to sibling when you have more than one child that's actively involved in the business? Is it the in-business heirs to the out-of-business heirs, the ones that's actively involved in the operation to those that aren't? Or is it the direct family members to those in-laws / outlaws, as a lot of people like to call them? Or is it just between the employees and the heirs? What do you see as the most challenging relationships with conflicts? I see some saying B and their spouses, A, parents to the kids, B, depends. There's an economist answer. A, C. We got someone saying C, the in business, the out of business. Another one saying C. Really depends. All right. Let's talk about how we can use family meetings to address each and every one of these situations, okay? So I like to talk about 3 different types of family meetings. I like to talk about farm operating meetings, family business meetings, and family council meetings. Now, if I ask a family that I'm working with, do you guys have family meetings? They'll say, oh, yeah. We meet every Monday morning, out in the shop, and we talk about what needs to be done this week. What fields need to be planted, what fields need to be sprayed, what cattle need to be worked. Those are not business meetings, right? Those are operating meetings. Those are things to deal with the very routine operational type things that are happening daily or weekly. I really want to get them to move beyond that and actually start developing some family business meetings at least once a quarter or more often to deal with some of the bigger 30,000 foot level strategies type planning things where we plan the future of our business. And then we're also going to talk about family council meetings where we bring everyone involved in the family together and really talk about how the business is impacting the family. Okay. So again, the who, what, when, where, farm operating meetings, those are just the primary, farm employees and managers, everyone that's actively involved. Again, those are what I call the 5,000 foot level discussions. What needs to be done today? They're happening very informally oftentimes. And where do they happen? They happen on the farm. But a family business meeting is different. It still involves everyone involved in the day-to-day operations, and it may involve key employees. It doesn't always have to, but it also may involve key advisors like vendors or distributors or our loan officer or our nutritionist, or our agronomy consultant. Those key advisors can help guide us in some of our key big issues. But these meetings are really to help us deal with strategic issues, to step back and look at that 30,000 foot level view of where do we want our business to go. Some of you have probably heard Dave Pratt with Ranching for Profit talk about the difference between working in the business versus working on the business. We tend to spend all of our time caught up in the day-to-day activities working in the business that we never step back and spend time working on the business. Now, again, how often or when should these meetings happen? Unfortunately, in most families, these meetings only happen when majorly big explosive issues are happening, such as dad's just been diagnosed with cancer. What on earth are we going to do? Or the farm next door is for sale. Are we going to buy it or are we not? or conflict has risen to the point where we just can't get along, so we need to call a meeting and try to deal with it. The reality is if I can get families into a schedule of, again, what I call intentional communication, where we have these meetings on a regular basis when there aren't big explosive issues to deal with, we can actually create a culture of group decision-making and inclusiveness. And when I say inclusiveness there, I'm not talking about diversity. I'm talking about, is everybody included in the discussion? Does everyone have a voice? Is dad calling all the shots, or is everyone having a chance to have let their opinion be voiced and then talked about? Now, where do we have these? Again, these we do not want to have at the farm. We don't want to have them at the kitchen table. It's too easy for distractions from the farm to occur, but it's also too easy to slip back into those family roles. We want to treat this like the professional meeting it is, and go to the local bank that has a boardroom, or even, rent a meeting room at the hotel. Again, these are very, very important meetings. When the board of directors of the local convenience store chain is trying to decide where to set up their next, location, they don't set up chairs between the aisle of the fountain drinks and the candy bars to have a meeting. They actually go away and have a professional board meeting the way it should. One of the things I think is really important for these family business meetings is to look at what your management structure looks like, or what I also call your decision authority tree. Can an operation, this is one of the things I make every one of my families try to do, is to sit down and draw out what their decision authority tree is. Who is responsible for making decisions? Is it a pine tree where dad or mom is at the top and is the only one allowed to make decisions? Or is one son in charge of the crops division and another one or daughter in charge of the livestock operation? Who's in charge of all the landlord negotiations? Who's in charge of all the machinery purchases? Again, if we can sit down and draw out who has the authority to make these decisions, it helps us think about and talk about in our meetings how we become better at this and making better decisions. And if a family struggles at this, I'll give you a quick, easy tip. Buy a 50-cent, or I guess you can't buy them for 50 cents anymore, but maybe if you get them in a package of 3, they're only 50 cents a piece, but a package of Post-it notes, and simply write down every management decision that needs to be made in the next 365 days. The landlord negotiations for the rent farms 1 through 5, the equipment purchases, the seed purchases, all of the management decisions that need to be made, write them down on a Post-it note, and then go over to the wall and start grouping them in groups of like decisions. Then take those and sit down and write out job descriptions. Write out job descriptions and say which son or daughter is going to take responsibility for this group of Post-it notes. And it can almost be freeing. It can almost be a little bit freeing for dad or mom to say, you're right. I don't have to be in charge of every decision on this farm. I can put my son-in-law in charge of this group of Post-it notes, and that's going to be where their responsibility is going to lie. I'm telling you, this is the idea of separating family from business and thinking about treating it like a professional management system. That just is so foreign to many of our operations. They say, I don't need job descriptions, and they don't have to be completely, complex, but just simply helping them outline who is responsible for what, and even how they are evaluated. Do you do an evaluation on each of your employees that are not family members? Well, then why aren't you doing evaluations on family members? And again, families think I'm a family business, I don't have to do that. But the more we can separate those family roles from the business roles, the better. Even, for instance, compensation packages. One of the common things that I hear, and I think I saw that in one of the things in chat, is, well, I show up at 5 a.m. every morning to feed the cows, but my brother shows up at 10:30, and by 2:30 he's gone. But we both receive the same compensation. Have you ever in the family actually had a discussion about what the time our day is supposed to start and when it's supposed to end? How about vacations? Do you get a set time that you're allowed to take vacations? Most families don't, right? They just, well, okay, if I can squeeze some time in off here, great. Every family needs to have a guaranteed option to be able to take a vacation at least once or twice a year. Again, allowing us to treat this like the business it should be helps go a long ways to avoiding that conflict. You probably heard the saying before, set a policy before there's a need. Well, most unfortunately have conflict arise, and then they have to go back and say, okay, how are we going to address this? But if we can talk about it up front and develop a policy before there's a need for this, it just goes a long ways to avoiding conflict. All right. Now, the other thing is goal sheets. Most of us do not like sitting down and actually outlining our goals, right? But the reality is 90% of the conflicts that I see in family businesses are either because we've got incompatible goals or we're not communicating. Often we're simply shooting at different targets, right? I have a different goal for where I want the business to go than my brother does or than my dad does. And we see this often in the difference between the senior generation and the younger generation, right? As the older generation gets older and gets closer to retirement, they get more conservative. They're not as aggressive wanting to grow and change. They're more thinking about being conservative in their viewpoints. Whereas the younger generation knows if they're going to generate enough income to provide for their salary, they need to grow and they need to take more risk. And so we're just often shooting at different moving targets. Early on, I realized that I would send a goal sheet home with a husband and wife and say, I want you to fill this out with questions like, hey, I'm willing to work 12 hours a day and never have a vacation for 10 years, and have them fill them out separately and then come back and look at the answers. And, often we found we had different goals and requirements for how we wanted to work and how we wanted to do things. So just getting our goals aligned helps a lot. Now, I want to transition from family business meetings to thinking about family council meetings, okay? And these are very different. So whereas the family business meetings involved all of those that were actively involved in the operation, family council meetings involve everybody that's in that family circle. The spouses, in-laws, children, grandchildren, absolutely everyone that's in that family circle falls into the family council meetings. And I didn't mention this, some in family business meetings, often a question I get is, are spouses included? I see different families do that differently. I have no problem personally with spouses being involved with the family business meetings as well, because I always say, who's the last person your son or daughter talks to at night? It's not you, okay? So your son or daughter's spouse is just involved with the family operation as your son or daughter is. So I have no problem with them being involved with the family business meetings. But on family council meetings, absolutely everyone's involved, including the kids that aren't actively involved in the farm. And it's really just a forum to educate everyone in the family what's going on in the business and to let them understand how the business issues are going to impact the family and how changes in the family are going to impact the business. How often do we have these? At least once a year, sometimes more often. And again, an appropriate place for this. Sometimes we can get by with having these at the family household, but I really like, once again, taking them off site if possible. And so that we can just kind of treat this more as a professional meeting that it is. I always say, again, don't do this around the holidays. You guys all know that. Don't do these around the holidays. Grandma passed the potatoes. What's in the will? We don't want to do that, right? So treat this like a business deductible expense that it is, and send your kids a plane ticket to come back at another time. Now, if they absolutely can't come back at another time, then do try to create some virtual options. Zoom has really helped with that. That's probably one good thing coming out of the pandemic, is at least we can all hop on Zoom and look each other in the face and see each other's facial changes whenever we're having these discussions. Now, to do these meetings effectively, I am really big on sending an agenda out ahead of time. Send an agenda out and say, these are the things we're going to talk about. If there's any key decisions that need to be made, these are the decisions we're going to have to talk about. We don't want surprises. I have yet, in the 10 years since I met Dr. Baker and I've been working in this field, I have yet to ever find a scenario where I'm like, yeah, I'm really glad we kept that a secret from everybody else. It's not pleasant, right? It's not always pleasant dealing with conflict and dealing with difficult situations. But the better way to deal with it is to just be open and honest and upfront and say, these are the issues we got to deal with. Let's rip off the Band-Aid and communicate about them. We do want to think about assigning roles. Who's going to lead the meeting? Is it always dad? Sometimes we have, in the case of family business meetings, we have division managers, in charge of the meeting. I really like, especially with family council meetings, rotating them, having a different son or daughter take charge of, this is my year to organize the family council meeting and provide the reports and organize it and make sure that everyone's involved. At some points it does come that we need an outside facilitator when the conflict has just gotten too high, that we need someone else to help mediate that process. We do want to assign or ask for volunteers for a note taker. And again, that's another one of those things that families like, why do we need to take notes? But I find so often that when someone is talking, are we truly listening, or are we formulating our rebuttal that we're going to say when it's our turn to talk? And often we don't actually hear what we think we heard. We also want to think about how decisions are going to be made. It's pretty important to talk about, does the senior generation make all the decisions? Are we just there to provide input into them? Do we have to reach consensus, majority? How are we going to actually, when there is conflict and key decisions need to be made, make those? Other things to think about to make a successful meeting is to try to, again, separate personal feelings from the business relationships here. Try not to take things personal as much as possible. I know that seems like it's common sense, but trust me, that is one of the most difficult things to do in this process. We want to try to stick to the agenda. When someone tries to take us down a rabbit hole, that's one reason we have an agenda, is to say, no, this is what we need to talk about today, and this is what we need to deal with. We want to start and end on time. We don't want to let these become something that we truly dread and that are just horrendous. We want to make sure that we're giving everyone a chance to contribute and that nobody dominates. Again, that is so difficult, especially in some families where one person just wants to dominate the conversation. And at some point, you just have to go into the kitchen and get the kitchen timer and say, everybody's going to have this many minutes to talk. And when that timer goes off, you got to sit down and shut up and let someone else speak. And that's where a good trained outside facilitator really earns their pay. Active and reflective listening is not something that comes natural to us. Let's face it, human beings are selfish by nature. That's just the way, you don't have to tell a 3-year-old to cry and want their way. We're selfish by nature. But we've all heard the statement, seek first to understand before being understood. Again, as I say, my wife always says whenever we're having a disagreement that I'm not really listening to her, but that I'm formulating my rebuttal in my mind while she's talking. And fortunately, sometimes she's right. We've got to learn to stop and not jump to our conclusions or judging what someone say, but actively being able to reflect and say, what I heard you say was X. Can you tell me more about that? I think one of the reasons why we're so afraid to have family meetings is that we feel like if everyone has a say, if everyone has a voice, then we have to do what everyone wants. And unfortunately, it's not like going through the drive-through at McDonald's. Everyone's not going to get what they asked for. Again, conflict is inevitable, okay? Everyone's not going to get what they want. But the key to working through it is actually dealing with the conflict and coming out with a good compromise solution on the other side, all right? Things we've got to think about is realize, I'm going to talk here in a minute, that often the senior generation views retirement as I'm obsolete. So we've got to be really sensitive to that. I get a chance to speak at a lot of beginning farmer conferences, and I try to help the younger generation realize, yeah, mom and dad, or specifically dad, doesn't want to talk about this stuff. And so we got to be careful how we approach it, but you got to realize how they're feeling. They're feeling like if they are being told they're obsolete, by you asking to be more involved. Now, that's not the way you see it, but you got to understand that sometimes they see that. We've got to try to steer to open versus closed questions in any type of communication forum. An open question elicits a more of a broader response than a closed question essentially asks for a yes or no answer. So examples of open questions are like, can you tell me more about that? What does that mean to you? And something that is less intuitive is just try to take the word why completely out of your vocabulary. Just think about how this sounds, so why didn't you get the chores done today versus what happened that prevented you from getting the chores done today? The word why automatically puts people in a defensive measure because it's a judgment. It's a judgment type word. And so try to take the word why out of your vocabulary. How do most families deal with conflict? Often it's stalling or denial, or at best it's segmentation, which is, okay, we'll deal with some of these issues, but you're not allowed to talk or ask about some of these other ones. What we really want to try to move families to is to integration or reaffirmation. Integration is where we realize, hey, yes, there is conflict. And so we want to find out more about that conflict. And then we actually want to acknowledge that the conflict exists so that we can find a solution to it. And again, those are not easy. I'm not saying this is easy at all, but that's where a good trained facilitator can help families move to. And families just need to realize that if they always stay in stalling and denial and segmentation, then the family business is never going to move beyond it. So one of the things, I'm on the schedule for these CEUs, actually probably about 2 months too early. We are in the process right now at the University of Missouri of developing a new set of worksheets. I know every university has their own worksheets, and most are probably better than what I'm developing. But we're developing a new set of guide sheets and worksheets to help people deal with each of these. And one of these worksheets is going to be specifically on helping them develop their calendar of not only their farm operating meetings, but also their farm business meetings and their family council meetings. And so there's going to be things in that worksheet to not only help them schedule them, but to help them set the agenda and think about the key decisions that need to be made during each one of these. So I will encourage you that in the next few months, check back with me and we'll have some new resources out there that I can share with you. Now, another thing I want you to put in no, I've already asked you to put this in the chat, but I want you to think about at least is when I think about these 5 challenging relationships that I've asked you to identify which ones were the most important, think about the ones A, B, and E, how the family business meetings can help deal with those. Think about how difficult it is between the parent and the son or daughter or the sibling to sibling. I find that, again, drawing that decision authority tree and actually writing out some key job descriptions with those Post-it notes go a long way to helping alleviate some of that conflict. If I can identify that, okay, my brother is in charge of this set of decisions and I am in charge of this other set, then we can realize that, okay, I can let him make those decisions and I'm going to make these. It goes a long ways to avoiding some of that conflict. I mentioned the compensation package. As I said, sibling and sibling rivalries often not necessarily even are on the management decisions, but it's just on, well, I'm working way harder than my brother or sister or my brother-in-law or sister-in-law, and we're both being compensated the same. No one wants to have those compensation discussions, but they're extremely important and help us avoid a lot of that conflict. Now, for C and D, this is where I think those family council meetings become so vital. And again, I think families avoid those like the plague because they just don't want to deal with that conflict. But again, I feel like families can accept difficult news and difficult decisions to work through when they are openly communicated to and they are told the why. I think the why becomes really important as well. So, okay, we're gonna try to do this so that we're gonna try to give your brother a sweetheart deal to buy the farm because unfortunately there's no way the farm will pay for full fair market value. But this is why we want to do this, because we want to see the business continue. That why becomes ultimately very, very important. And again, this is why I think the extended family is so important to be involved in those meetings that are not actively involved in the operation, because they need to be told as well. And again, I've yet to see a scenario where I can say, yeah, I'm glad we kept that a secret. Now, I've got about 20 minutes left, and I want to talk. I'm just going to dive off into a couple of the big conflicts that I see that every family has to deal with. So I'm going to take these first two on this list, being fair versus trying to preserve the farm, so that whole fair versus equal, and the relinquishing versus retaining control issue. Okay. So I want you to put in the chat, should the on-farm heir be required to buy out the off-farm siblings? Yes or no? And of course, last night in my meeting, I asked them to tell me the why at their table, but unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to do that. But yes or no? Should the on-farm heir be required to buy out the off-farm siblings? Yes or no? Please put that in the chat. I got one no, one yes. Got lots of no's. I got to go back up here. The farm is linked to the business, so it depends. No, no, no. Partially. Yes, with some sweat equity credit, not unless they are fairly compensated. Yes, with the consideration of sweat equity. So as I said, yes, we had a reduced rate. So I'm in the middle of a series where we got a traveling road show and we're going all over the state. I love throwing this question out and saying, I want you guys to talk about it at your table, and I want you to tell me what you think, because you get all over the board answers, just like I've got all over the board here in the chat. And I really love, especially like when I do beginning farmer conferences, I make them number off 1 through 3 or however many groups I'm going to separate them in, because I really want spouses separated. I want mom and dad separated from the kids. I really want them in arbitrary groups for this discussion. And because I feel like this, this whole idea of fair versus equal is the biggest elephant in the room that probably every family is going to have to deal with unless they stopped after one child, right? So, I think one of the things that just is continually making this more and more complicated is land values, right? Just think about what has happened to land prices. 2020 for us was the only year that we broke through the 6% trend line, but 2021 and 2022, we're right back above. Land values are just through the roof, right? So this makes this decision harder and harder to think about the fair versus equal discussion. But one of the things I learned from John is that we really have 3 goals as succession planners, right? It's not just successfully transitioning the business to the next generation, but it's doing it in a way that actually gives the next generation the best chance to be a thriving business, and also to protect and maintain family relationships. And we've got to be very careful to remember 2 and 3 and how they go into this. And unfortunately, with land values where they're at, we've got to deal with the difference between cash generation and wealth accumulation. Unfortunately, in farming, often we don't generate enough cash to make the land payments, do we? But the land, as we've seen in appreciating land values, tend to double every 10 to 12 years. Now, don't say that land can't go down. It can, and it does. But over time, land has been a good investment. So it accumulates and goes up in value. So how do we deal with that if we have 4 children and only one of them wants to take over the operation, but we can't require them to buy out the other 3 and it be a profitable business? So how do we deal with this? One of my recent columns that I wrote, I just titled it, "Could you afford to start over?" So could you afford to buy all of your land today at fair market value, all your machinery and all your livestock, and start over at full market price? And unfortunately, none of us probably could, right? So this is where it comes back to those 3 circles and starting to think about the intersection between our estate and succession plans. So, if we're going to have different kids in different circles and not in all 3, then we have to think about how those overlaying areas connect. And one of the things that I think, Dr. Baker used to always say is, how important is it to you that a Smith will continue to farm Smith land? If it is really, really important to you that a Smith is going to be farming Smith land 10 years from now, then you've got to think about how how your interrelationships between these circles are going to work, right? And it is vitally important for the senior generation to understand that it is their responsibility to do this. Now, there are tools in the toolbox, right? There are things like life insurance, to try to make things equal. There are buy-sell agreements, first option to purchase, separating the actual operating enterprise from the land holding enterprise, different entity structures, trust, long-term lease. There are tools in the toolbox. But what I want families to understand, and I always stress, is if you want to achieve goal number 2 and number 3, this has to be established prior to your death. The idea of saying, and I hear this too many times, well, my kids all get along and they will work it out after I'm gone. That is the recipe for disaster, right? That is pretty much a guarantee that your kids are never going to have another Christmas dinner at your household after the funeral. It just doesn't happen. So it is the parents' responsibility to establish this and to establish these linkages. If I am going to have some kids in only the ownership circle while other kids are in both the ownership and the business circle, then it becomes vitally important that I establish those linkages between the two. Dick Whitman actually even describes them as a train track. If you've got some kids on the ownership train and some kids on the business train, then it's your responsibility to establish the train track between the two of those. I would also say we've got to step back and think about, what each of those circles is entitled to. I actually see some businesses that say, hey, you are in the family circle because you were born in this family. We cannot kick you out. However, if you want to be in the business circle, you want a job in this family business, then you're required to go get the skills and abilities to do that. Just because, my sister's son has 3 DWIs and can't get a job anywhere else does not mean I have to employ him in the family business. It is an opportunity to have a job in the family business, but it is not an entitlement. And some businesses also view ownership in the exact same way. Not only are you given the choice, do you want a job in the family business, you're given a choice, do you want to be an owner in the family business? And as such, you're required to make either an investment of sweat equity or an investment in a financial contribution into the business and buy your way into the business. That, again, it's not an entitlement. And I think it's interesting when I see families treat it that way, treat each circle completely as independent and separate. And some kids will say, yeah, I want to work in the family business, or no, I want to go be a pharmacist. And some kids will also say, yeah, I want to buy into the family business, or no, I'd really rather invest my money elsewhere. But see, they don't treat it as it's an automatic inheritance in that way. It's an opportunity, but not an entitlement. I think that's an interesting way of looking at it. The other thing I said I was going to mention real quickly in about my last 10 minutes, why is it just so hard for dad or grandpa to relinquish control of management decisions? And I would love to have you type in chat here, but I think it would take more time and we'd have some pretty lengthy discussions that would have to go in there. But this is another one of those that I throw out at the tables last night, and I'll do later this week at the other workshops. And I just have the families talk about them. And it's interesting to see what they come back with. They usually come back with the answers that I think they will. But sometimes they come back with different ones. But again, you guys probably remember Dr. Baker using this example. I heard him tell this story so many times of he's just not ready producer, right? He used to say that the senior farmer was always telling him that my son's just not ready to take over control, right? He's just not ready to make management decisions. And so finally, John asked him, he said, well, when do you think he will be ready? And the farmer said in another five years. Well, if you know anything about Dr. Baker, you know the secret to this, but most people don't. The senior farmer was actually 96 and his son was 72 at the time. And so I remember Dr. Baker saying, well, you better be taking good care of your health if you're not going to give up management control till you're 101. So who really wasn't ready, right? Well, it wasn't the 72-year-old, it was the 96-year-old. And so, I get to wear a lot of different hats with the university. I get to teach HR classes for beginning supervisors as well. And so I spend a lot of time going into the differences between nature and nurture, personality styles, are your nature, and those are pretty evident by the time you're 3. The generational cohorts have a nurturing impact on the way we view life and family dynamics as well. If you are working with families in family conflict, I always recommend that you have each family do a personality assessment, because often we can see a lot of our conflict comes back to just the way we view the world differently, kind of like I said about goals. Now, I use true colors. Some people prefer DISC. There's about 15 different personality tests out there. Whichever one you are the most comfortable with, I would recommend you use. But I really think these help a lot of people see that, wait a minute, you're approaching these things from an analytical perspective, whereas I'm approaching them from a change perspective. And so those are very, very different. I've been using True Colors with my producers, I don't know, somewhere between 10 and 15 years. The other thing I think about is the generational cohort. So there's no doubt, we know that a generation's formative experiences that they went through impact their life. So, the matures, my grandparents went through World War II and the Great Depression. And so those things made them have very, very strong tendencies to be diligent, hardworking, duty before pleasure. They were ready to sacrifice for the greater good, right? Now, the baby boomers went through a different set of life experiences, and they have more of a live to work perspective. So whereas the matures, they gave everything for the good of others for their job, and they would sacrifice, but they once they got there, they couldn't give anything up. Well, the boomers, they also have that same tendency, but it's because their work is their life. Even non-farmer boomers find it very, very difficult to retire because their life is all about who they are as work. But I will tell you, those tendencies also make boomers very, very sensitive to feedback and make them judgmental of those who think differently. So again, when my dad and I would have conflict, he was not real open to allowing me to try new things differently, pretty judgmental of those, but it came back to the way those boomers were raised and the tendencies that they had. Now, contrast that to the millennials. We know they've went through a completely different set of life experiences that make them very innovative and self-confident, but it also makes them more socially conscious. They are more concerned about the group than they are necessarily the individual. But the other thing about that to them is they demonstrate respect after being treated with respect. They don't deal, I tell my supervisors all the time, they don't deal well with flashing the badge. You can't go in as the boss and flash the badge and say, do this because I told you so. They are really drawn to competence. So if you show them that you are good at what you do and show them the why, they will follow you to the end of the moon. But you have to approach them differently than you did a baby boomer or a mature. And so just think about even how that affects our work ethic. We're 3:00 on Friday and my daughter has a soccer game. Does the combine shut down or not? The mature or the baby boomer would absolutely not shut down that combine, whereas the Generation X and the millennials are more likely to say, no, I'm going to go spend some time at my kid's ball game, and I'll get back to this when I can. But I think this idea of relinquishing versus retaining control even goes beyond our personality styles and our generational differences. And I think Shane is actually on the call today. Dr. Shane Conway is one of our board of directors on IFTN. And I have just learned a lot from reading his research into symbolic capital. We're all familiar with economic capital and social capital and cultural capital, but for a farmer, symbolic capital is something that is completely different. And it is really about their sense of belonging and identity in society. And these slides right here are actually Shane's. I asked him if I could use them. But, their research finding at the University of Ireland, what they're going through is just looking at how that status as a farmer affects who they feel that they are and their identity in society. So if I am not a farmer, what am I? So just think about how the average person views retirement. Someone who's driven a truck for 30 years or taught school for 30 years, they view retirement as something to be celebrated and look forward to, right? But how does a farmer view retirement? It's something to be feared, again, because if I am not a farmer, what am I? And I think this has so many implications for the way we help producers through this. You know, if you think about the typical farm succession, is as soon as we are able to carry a feed bucket or reach the clutch on a tractor, we are considered a grunt, right? We're given chores. And when we become an adult, we hopefully progress to what we would call an assistant manager, or a grunt level 2 is what I really call it, because you're given lots and lots of responsibility for production decisions and sweat labor, but you're really never given much management authority until someone dies and you get to become CEO, right? But it requires my dad or grandpa to die before I get to actually take the head of the business. I think as professionals working with producers, I think our biggest challenge, and what I hope to focus the remaining 15 years of my career in, is helping farmers understand they can still be a farmer and they can still have identity as a farmer as they transition from the key decision maker to an advisor or a mentor. See, it doesn't have to be complete withdrawal. Even though mom may want to get an RV and travel, all right, we can still satisfy mom and travel a little bit more while staying actively involved in the farm, but we don't have to be the one there calling the shots every day, making every management decision. And again, that is the hardest transition a farmer, and particularly a male farmer, will ever make, is making that transition from CEO to advisor / mentor. But one of the things I call my producers out on when they're struggling with this is I flat out ask them, which do you value more, your success or seeing your kids be successful? Because I have literally seen farmers sabotage their children, holding them back so that they can continue to be successful. Because see, the reality is, I said we're selfish by nature. In Western culture, we are taught that life is a game. Life is a game, and we are to accumulate and win until we draw our last breath. And so that's why when we had a recent land sale, the two final competitors trying to win the land sale, trying to buy it, was an 84-year-old and a 92-year-old. Again, it's I've got to continue to win the game until I draw my final breath. But we just came out of the Olympics last winter, and I try to help them understand that a family business, don't lose the word family in there. It is not an individual competition like some of our Olympic sports is, it is a team competition. And at some point in your life, if you want your next generation to be successful, you have to realize my role on the team has to go from being the star quarterback or the guy calling all the shots to the coach. And again, that's not an easy transition, but I think that is our role as professionals in the succession planning world, is to help them understand that and help them make that transition. Succession planning is a process, right? It's not an event. Unfortunately, way too many people view succession planning as an event. Today, all of this stuff is mine. Tomorrow, I die, and it's all yours. That's estate planning, folks. That's estate planning. That's the difference between estate planning and succession planning. Succession planning is a process. Estate planning is an event, all surrounding an event, which is a funeral. All right. So we're developing some guide sheets on this as well to try to help people think through those different stages and to think through what management decisions I'm going to make at key points and at what point I start turning these sets of decisions over to the next generation. And again, I know it sounds kind of corny, but I really like that little Post-it note activity, because it just helps them start thinking about, yeah, in 2 years, I want to transition this group of Post-it notes to my son or daughter. I don't have to be keeping in charge of those. We're also developing a guide sheet on helping to think about those roles and utilize those 3 circles. If you've not been actively using those, every family I work with, I draw the Tagari Davis 3 circles of family, ownership, and business, and have them think through how each of their kids are going to fall into those. And I actually, in the guide sheets that I'm developing a set of questions that I tell them to take to their kids and have each of their kids fill out, such as, what roles do I want to play now, but what roles do I want to play 5 years from now? And what ownership rights do I like? Am I, if I'm not actively involved in the family business, am I only concerned with having hunting rights? Maybe knowing that can help us think about some kind of equitable split in this. And again, I kind of close out with asking all of the people to remember, there's my timer, so I've hit my hour, asking them to remember that producer that had a successful business, but that the wheels came off the bus after the funeral. And then I asked them, how would that operation have been different if they had actually had a roadmap, if they had actually followed through the 5 phases of succession planning, which we didn't have time to cover today, but that they had viewed it as a process instead of an event. If that family had viewed the family circle separate from the business circle and separate from the ownership circle, and if they'd had family meetings where they actually communicated about all of these. Again, communication's not always easy. But that is absolutely the key to a successful business. And then we're trying to develop handouts on each and every one of those.